So this is the open workshop, March 16th, 2021. I'll take a roll call. Trustee Burke.
Here.
Trustee Cassius.
Here.
Trustee Egan.
Here.
Trustee Finity is Zooming with us. Trustee Splafane.
Here.
Trustee Watson.
Here.
Trustee Wilbeck will be absent for the open workshop. Vice President Munoz.
Here.
President Villado.
Here.
We're going to go right into our presentation. For some of the trustees that may not know her, Mary Ann Friedman is our New Jersey School Board's representative. And she's here tonight. You're going to see her tonight, and we're going to be lucky enough to see her next month. But tonight is on ethics, and I'm going to turn the meeting over to her.
Nope.
Maybe?
Hold on.
I hear you.
Nope. Mayor, hold on 1 second.
Let me see that.
Okay.
Just this here.
Technology's
Good.
Okay, be right back. Test.
Try again, Mayor. Nope.
Okay, here.
Hold on 1 second. What's that? Mine out, right?
What, headphones? Headphones, internal?
Nope. Speaker internal or projector?
Yeah, not projector.
Huh?
Not
No,
projector,
projector.
speaker.
Mayor, try now.
Can everyone hear me?
Come here, hear them.
I can hear you.
1 second, Mary, okay?
Okay.
There's nothing I can do, it says headphone.
Not yet, nope. 1 second. Before we too short here.
It's not hooked up to the speakers, it's only hooked up to the cameras.
I can go to the speaker here if you want. So top. Nope.
I don't think it's something yet.
Well, it looks like we can't do it, technology, so keep it moving. What's next on the agenda?
Do you want me to jump up and do
No, we're good,
technical?
we're good, we're good, we're good.
No, we're not, Tom, let's keep it moving.
Mayor, try one more time.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Is that too low?
That's all.
It's good, yeah, no, we're good.
Too low?
We're good.
We're good?
Okay. Good.
Go ahead, Mary.
Okay, can I share my screen?
Sure can.
Okay.
I took it out, yeah, took it out, no, not connected.
Good job. Okay, good.
Okay, here we go. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all tonight, even though I can't see most of you. I hope everybody is doing well, that you and your families are all well and safe during this pandemic. It's been quite the experience. If you had told me last year that we would be doing this a year later, I would have said you were all crazy. So, it's a pleasure to be meeting with you even virtually. And I've been asked to talk to you to help to guide your ethics discussion tonight. So we're going to go through this because we did this last year. So there's not been too many changes, but the School Ethics Act became effective in April of 1992 because the legislature felt it was essential that the conduct of board members of education and local administrators hold the respect and the confidence of the people. And in order to do that, they felt that board members and administrators must avoid conduct that would be a violation of the public trust and justifiable impression that the trust is being violated. So they also wanted to develop some specific standards that would help board members guide their conduct and give some kind of a disciplinary mechanism for them to ensure uniform maintenance of these standards. And the provisions of this act also apply to charter school trustees and administrators. So in CUSAC, which is the New Jersey Quality Single Accountability Continuum, there is a governance indicator that deals with the Code of Ethics, and the purpose was to ensure transparency in the ethical conduct of Board of Education members. And it's monitored remotely by annual online completion of the required disclosure statements for board members and school administrators, and we at NJSBA have to complete those personal and financial disclosure statements as well. They came out a little bit this year. It's all done electronically, so that does make it a little bit easier. And hopefully everyone anybody who was sworn in January had 30 days to do it. If you're an existing board member, you have until April 30th. Obviously, Dr. Maida will probably be communicating with you if you haven't filled those out and completed them, because it does require that you have a timely submission of those. Then that you also have an annual discussion of the School Ethics Act, and that's going to be demonstrated in your board minutes, your official board minutes. And then any board member or administrator that is found to be in violation of the School Ethics Act has to be listed on CUSAC as well. So the School Ethics Act actually established then the School Ethics Commission, which for tonight's purposes will be the SEC, not the Securities and Exchange Commission. It developed the Code of Ethics in 2001, 9 years later. It established conflicts of interest, which is really for the protection of board members, then the board, and then the district. And we'll go into those a little bit later. The disclosure statements that we just talked about, personal, relative, and financial disclosure statements that go directly to the DOE, and then training requirements for board members. And so if you are a first-year board member in a 3-year term, so you've been elected or appointed for 3 years, you will need to take new board member orientation or governance 1, and that's going to give you the skills and the knowledge that's necessary to serve. It will talk to you about CUSAC. It will give you an overview of HIV, harassment, intimidation, and bullying, and the statutes around that and the guidelines for that. We'll talk to you about CUSAC. We'll also talk to you and review the superintendent's evaluation process. And that's supposed to happen within 6 months of your being sworn into office. Then in years 2 and 3 of a first term, so a term is usually a 3-year term, in second year you would take Governance 2, which is school finance, and in year 3 you would take Governance 3, which is student achievement. And then any year that you've been reelected or reappointed, you would need to take Governance 4, which provides advanced training on legal updates and also gives you additional information about HIV. And so any newly elected, appointed, or reelected or appointed board member would get information on harassment, intimidation, and bullying, and what your board's and district responsibilities are. And that's generally required in new board member orientation and then again in Governance 4. And again, Governance 4, so if you're on for 3 terms or 9 years, you will actually have taken Governance 4 twice. You'll take it in the beginning of your second term, and you would have taken it in the beginning of your third term. And then if you run again, you would take it again if you were reelected. So the School Ethics Commission is comprised of 9 members that are appointed by the governor to serve for a 3-year term. And right now we have 6 people that are currently appointed. There are 2 school administrators, there are 5 non-school officials, and 2 school board members. And no more than 5 can be from any one political party. And the SEC's jurisdiction, again, SEC is for the School Ethics Commission. They provide a school official with an advisory opinion And advisory opinions are something that has not happened yet. So it's something that is a proposed activity or conduct by a school official or a school board member. For instance, when I was elected to my board back in the late 90s, we had April elections at that point, and one of the women that was elected at the same time that I was in that election came to the board right after we had been sworn in, and she said, "My husband is thinking of running for the town council. Would there be any conflicts of interest for me if he should gain a seat on the town council?" We asked our board attorney to ask for an advisory opinion, and it came back within about 6 weeks. They do turn those around pretty quickly. Came back within about 6 weeks, and it gave us a delineated list of what she would or wouldn't be able to participate in. And basically it said if he was elected, which he was, remember back in the day, we used to have to vote on board budgets, and if the budget went down, the Board of Education would then go to the Township Committee and ask for them to keep you whole, keep your budget whole, or, talk to them about what was going on with your budget. And so if she participated in that from a board perspective, in going to the Township Committee, her husband would have to recuse himself, or vice versa. If he wanted to participate from a Township Committee perspective, she would have to recuse herself. So advisory opinions are something that's proposed or that might happen, and they give you a very good idea of what the School Ethics Commission would rule if somebody filed a complaint. So those are really good things to have if you think that there's something coming up that may be an issue for you or for your district. And then ethics complaints can be filed by anybody. Only a school official can ask for an advisory opinion, but an ethics complaint can be filed by anybody. It doesn't have to be a town member. It can be anybody. It can be one board member to another. It can be an administrator to a board member to an administrator. But these are things that have already happened. So if somebody felt that somebody had violated the School Ethics Act, they could file a complaint to the School Ethics Commission, and all of that information is delineated on the DOE website under ethics, and then it walks you through the process. Filing a complaint is not something that takes 5 minutes. It's a very deliberative act, and it's something that really they want you to really think about before you send it off, because if you send off a capricious or a non-sustainable violation or complaint, you can be fined up to $500 for that. So it's a clear process that they want you to really think out. So if somebody is deemed to have violated one of the tenets of the Code of Ethics, the SEC would recommend to the commissioner either a reprimand, a censure, a suspension, or a removal. And the SEC does make the recommendations to the commissioner for final agency decision, and appeals are heard by the appellate division. So in 2020, there were 21 advisory opinions that were drafted, 22 mandatory training violations that were reviewed by the School Ethics Commission, and then 28 school ethics violations. Of the 21 advisory opinions, only one advisory opinion was made public. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. The mandatory training violations are starting to be taken very seriously by the SEC. And in fact, they removed 8 members. This is recommended to the commissioner that 8 members be removed. 4 members have each a 30-day suspension and a reprimand to the other 10 members. And then in the school ethics violations, there were 28 that were submitted, 24 were dismissed, and 4 cases have been recommended to the commissioner, and they'll be discussed later in this presentation as well. So the only public advisory opinion that was made public in 2020 was a superintendent's sister-in-law, actually his brother's wife, was a lunch aide in the district, and she was hired before the superintendent was hired and was selected by principals as the finalist for a secretarial position. So the superintendent's brother's wife had applied for a position, an elevated position within the district as a secretary, and the principals wanted to select her as a finalist. So the superintendent has to recommend any hires other than the next superintendent. So the superintendent asked the SEC if it was fair to prohibit a qualified and vetted employee that someone else had done the vetting for and was recommending to move into another role only because the brother-in-law was the superintendent. And the SEC advised that he would, in fact, be violating the SEC, the Code of Ethics if he was to recommend the appointment of his sister-in-law. That the public could perceive the action as securing an unwarranted privilege, and that it would leave a justifiable impression that the public trust was being violated. The superintendent also needed to recuse themselves, they advised, of any discussion of his sister-in-law's employment. They also went further to say that the sister-in-law was free to pursue positions in other districts and that she could be considered for a promotion once the superintendent was no longer superintendent in that district. So they really did give some good guidance to the superintendent. I'm sure it's not what they necessarily wanted to hear, but they gave good guidance as to what the superintendent could do and could not do. So we're going to go into the 10 tenets of the Code of Ethics, and I'm going to read the tenet, which is the bold at the top, and then the standards that's listed below are the things that a board member or anyone would have to supply to the School Ethics Commission to demonstrate that somebody violated that particular tenet of the code. So the first is, I'll uphold and enforce all laws, rules, and regulations of the State Board of Ed and court orders pertaining to schools, and desired changes shall be brought about only through legal and ethical procedures. And this is really about letting you know that you don't want to be bending the rules or suggesting that anybody bend the rules for anybody else, that you're going to enforce all the laws. That's part of the oath that you take, that you'll uphold the Constitution of the United States and of New Jersey, and that you'll also make sure that you're enforcing all of your own laws and state rules and local laws. And your local laws are basically your policies to a certain extent. So you want to make sure that you're a policy-making body, that you're really looking at those policies when you're acting on items at a board meeting that need to be approved. The second is to make decisions in terms of the educational welfare of children and seek to develop and maintain public schools that meet the individual needs of all children, regardless of their ability, race, creed, sex, or social standing. So this is really what's doing what's in the best interest of all of the students in your district and not basing decisions on particular special interest groups or any personal agendas. And again, the standard at the bottom talks about what you would have to provide as evidence to indicate that somebody had violated that particular tenet of the Code of Ethics. The next is to confine my board action to policy making, planning, and appraisal, and will help to frame policies and plans only after the board has consulted those who will be affected by them. So this is about being a policy making body as a board, not becoming involved in the day-to-day administration of the district or the implementation of the policies or goals. Those are the roles of the professionals, of the educators that you've employed as administrators for them to be able to do that. The next D is to carry out your responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with your fellow board members to see that they're well run. So your role is not to actually manage the school district or to administer the schools. It's to see that they're well run. You are oversight folks. You are to determine what it is as a body, as a board body, you would like to see happen in the schools. And then the administration, your superintendent and the administrative team determine how they're going to make that happen for you. So the superintendent's role is to carry out what the board directs them to do. And this is one of those cases where everybody needs to really kind of be on the same page, administration and the board, developing a vision, a mission, and goals for the district so that you can know that you're all on the same page and that you're going to then relinquish that. You've determined the what you want to see happen by vision, mission, and goals, and then your administrative team, guided by the superintendent, are going to determine how to best do that. The next is to recognize that authority rests with the Board of Ed and make no personal promises or take any private action that may compromise the board. And this is really important because only the full board has the authority to make decisions and to provide direction to the superintendent. So you don't want to make promises or take any kind of personal action, private action that could compromise the board. The board directs the superintendent individual board members do not direct the superintendent, or any staff member for that matter. The board itself, as a body, would direct the superintendent, and then the superintendent would direct the rest of the staff. Because as you probably are aware, you have one employee, and that is the superintendent. Everybody else, the superintendent answers to you, and everybody else on staff answers to the superintendent. So the next is to refuse to surrender your independent judgment to special interest or partisan political groups, or to use the schools for personal gain or for the gain of friends. So you want to make sure that you're basing all of your decisions on policy, goals, your vision and mission for the district, and not be swayed by any special interest or partisan political groups. The Board of Ed should be a nonpartisan group of folks who come together to do what's in the best interest of all of the students in the district. This is the one that is most often most violated by board members, and sometimes it's not through intent. Sometimes board members will let things slip. But you want to hold confidential all matters pertaining to the schools, which if disclosed would needlessly injure individuals or the schools. In all other matters, I'll provide accurate information and in concert with my fellow board members, interpret to the staff the aspirations of the community for the schools. So this is one of those things where some of you, and I can't see you also, but some of you will probably remember the commercials from the past that said what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in executive session needs to stay in executive session. And if somebody can't be in executive session because they have a conflict of interest with something that's being discussed there, that should not mean that you call them on your way out and say, by the way, this is what we talked about. Because it's for their protection, as well as for the board's protection, as well as for the district's protection, that those matters not be disclosed until they can be made public. Okay? So remember, what happens in exec stays in exec. The next, we're almost at the end, is to vote to appoint the best qualified personnel available after consideration of the recommendation of the Chief Administrative Officer. And this is what I had mentioned before. The superintendent has to make all the recommendations for all of the hires in the district. The only person that he would not make the recommendation to hire is your next superintendent if he were to be leaving, or retiring. So this is where the board and the superintendent really need each other, because the superintendent has to make the recommendation for any hires and the board has to approve those. So we're not suggesting that you just rubber stamp anything. This is one of those things where you want to have conversations when vacancies are coming up within the district as to what the administration is looking for and what the board might be looking for, keeping in mind that your superintendent is the person with the experience, the educational background, and the certification to make those recommendations for hiring. And if anything goes awry with any of those appointments or recommendations, it's the superintendent certification that's on the line. So even if you were as a board member in Bayonne, you were a superintendent in another district, your certification would not be in jeopardy as a board member on Bayonne's Board of Education. So you want to make sure that you're having conversations about who the next best person is going to be, what the qualifications will be. And also the board should be looking at the job descriptions to make sure that they've been revised recently, that they're up to date, and that the job description really does review and talk about what that person's going to be doing. The next tenet is to support and protect school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. And this is so that you're making sure that anything that is personnel related or student personnel related is maintained in executive session and is held confidential. And it can be the kind of thing where somebody asks you at the football field or at a basketball game, or I'm not sure what sporting events are happening in your district right now that are being permitted, but somebody could say, how did you find Mrs. Friedman as Eva's second grade teacher last year? And if you say, well, I found her to be a little difficult to work with because Eva had some issues in that, as a second grader with that teacher, that could turn around that somebody could perceive you saying that teacher was not a good teacher. and that could result in an ethics violation. So you need to be really careful about conversations that you have with other folks in terms of personnel. And the best thing to do is really not to comment on personnel, because anything that has to do with personnel or with students or with negotiations or any kind of property acquisition, anything like that, those are all covered by the by confidentiality and are supposed to be discussed in executive session. So you want to make sure that you're supporting and protecting school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. And then last is I'll refer all complaints to the Chief Administrative Officer and act on the complaints at public meetings only after failure of an administrative solution. This is really important because board members are people who we understand care deeply about the students in their communities and about their communities. So your first inclination as a board member is often to try to help and to want to try to help. But this is one of those situations where you have to refer people, understand what your chain of command is for folks. If it's a parent that's complaining about a teacher, they need to talk to the teacher first. Then they would go to an assistant principal, maybe then the principal, perhaps then to an assistant superintendent, then to the superintendent, and then if all else fails, those complaints would come to the Board of Education if they haven't been resolved. But you want to refer people back to the chain of command. And if it's an employee, their grievance process is outlined in their negotiated agreement. So you would want to make sure that if an employee calls you, you would let them know that they need to go to their building rep and talk to them and go through the grievance process. And then after you refer somebody, whether it be a community member, a parent, or a teacher, or a staff member to the chain of command, you need to send the superintendent a quick email saying, giving, just the basics. Mrs. Friedman called, she had a complaint about Eva's second grade teacher, and I wanted to let you know that I referred her back to the teacher and then through the chain of command. And you're referring people back to the chain of command because the lowest level in the chain is where these things are resolved most expediently, most of the time. And a resolution doesn't necessarily mean that the person got what they wanted. It may mean that they understand why they can't get what they wanted. And then if all else fails and they've gone through that chain up to the superintendent, it's still not resolved from the parent or the teacher's standpoint or community member standpoint, then it will come to the Board of Education. But if you've been involved in trying to fix this in any way, shape, or form, other than referring somebody to the chain of command, you'll likely have to recuse yourself from that board action, which would help the individual with resolution. Okay, any questions on the tenets of the Code of Ethics so far?
Nope.
Okay, moving on. So some SEC commissioner decisions. A board member employed as a teacher in another district failed to disclose income received as president of that district's education association. That was something that was found to be a violation of the financial disclosure statements, and the penalty of that board member was a censure. A teacher parent sent an email to the full board about the superintendent's handling of an incident. A board member intending to email the board used reply all so that the parent and teacher also received the email that absolutely included details of the board's executive session discussion of the incident. So I have one of my biggest advisories to you. I'm sorry, I'm really having trouble tonight with words. One of my biggest recommendations to you is to never reply all. And any information that you receive as a board member from the administration, from the superintendent, or even from the board president needs to be considered one-way information to you. If you need to reply to something or you need to talk to somebody about what you received in an email, call that person. This was viewed to have been a violation of the Code of Ethics with confidentiality and also the potential to violate the Open Public Meetings Act. And the penalty that was recommended was a reprimand, and the commissioner's decision has not been available yet. So those were two particular issues. This one was a humdinger, as my dad would say. A board member posted content on a blog that contained deliberate, repeated, and unnecessary attacks of the qualification, salary, and general employment of a tenured teacher in the district. And this was submitted in 2019. This one was a doozy. There were several violations of C, gross misrepresentation of the post that were meant to interfere with negotiations, framed policies and plans before the board consulted those will be affected by them. E, the board member was smearing and verbally attacking a staff member in a public forum, which diminished the board's integrity and may intimidate the public to address the board in the future. And it also harmed the board members' ability to properly teach and perform their obligations. So the penalty was a 6-month suspension. The board member argued his rights as a private citizen, and you do have rights as a private citizen. And he used the required disclaimer that he was not speaking on behalf of the board. This was the first time that the SEC said that there was enough reference to the board member being a board member throughout the blog so that they were not convinced that he was acting as a private citizen. So even sometimes saying, this is my own, personal opinion, I'm responding as a community member or a public, a citizen of the community. I don't speak for the board, nor do I have authorization to speak for the board, nor does this necessarily represent the board's opinion. It may not be enough. So you have to be really, really careful. Board members will often say at this point, well, you're telling me that once I become a board member, I lose my First Amendment rights. That's not what we're saying at all. And that's not what the legislature is saying either. What they are saying, though, is that there may be penalties, there may be implications and some penalties and some, repercussions that if you do use your First Amendment rights and they have something to do with the board or with the school district. So this was really the first time. So please be very, very careful. I feel always that part of my responsibility is to let you know what you need to do to keep yourselves out of trouble, so to speak, and I take that very seriously. So if you ever have a question about posting something or asking a question or anything else, please feel free to give me a call, and I can guide you as best I can. If I can't, I can put you in touch with one of our attorneys that can provide you with information as well. The next one was the commissioner had I'm sorry?
You okay?
Oh, okay. The commissioner had revoked a district send receive relationship with an out-of-state district and identified an in-state district to receive the district's students instead. The decision impacted the board president's child. The board president participated fully in actions that resulted in the passing of a board resolution to continue the relationship with the out-of-state district with tuition to be paid by the district, which was felt to be a blatant disregard of the commissioner's decision and a clear and palpable conflict of interest. This was a violation. The penalty was a censure, and the reason the penalty was a censure was because the member was off of the board, so their options really were limited, but the SEC would have recommended removal of the board member. So you can see that there are some serious things going on when the SEC is looking at these submissions of claims of violation. The next was a board member attended an all expenses paid conference offered by a potential vendor that the member had introduced to the district based on a pre-existing condition. This was a violation also. There was a 6-month suspension. They took action, the board member took action that were unrelated to their duties. There was no reason for a board member to go to this conference, all expenses paid. For something that he could recommend to the board anyway, it would have to come from the administration. And they felt that he had used his position to gain benefit for himself as a free out-of-state trip, The SEC's recommendation was removal to deter other school officials from accepting the gifts. The commissioner amended the penalty to 6-month suspension. The board member is currently appealing that 6-month suspension. However, they are suspended during that appeal process. So again, the SEC is getting strict on these things. So here's a question for you. There's a board resolution to approve the hiring of the architecture firm that you work for. Can you participate in that vote? No. Good. No, you cannot. Okay, so here are some conflicts of interest that are in 18A. You need to recuse yourself as a board member if there's an immediate benefit to you as a school official or your immediate family. An immediate family is defined as a spouse or dependent child residing in the same household. So if you or a spouse or dependent child in your household would get an immediate benefit because of a business interest, use of position to secure unwarranted privileges, financial involvement, gift favor offered with the intent to influence, personal involvement that could create a benefit, or service or employment that may prejudice somebody's independent judgment, you would not be able to participate in the discussion or the vote on those items. So now, who qualifies as a relative? So your immediate family is considered the spouse or dependent child residing in the same household. You can see that the accountability regulation definition, which came about in about 2008, has really been broadened. So it's a spouse or civil union or domestic partner, parent, step-parent, child, stepchild, son, daughter-in-law, grandparent, grandchild, siblings, stepbrothers, stepsisters, half-brothers, half-sisters, aunts, uncles, nieces, and nephews, and often sometimes cousins as well. And this is whether they're related to the school official or your spouse by blood marriage or adoption. So they really expanded the definition, and what we do suggest is that every year at reorganization, any board member who has a family member who works in the district or works in another district, or a relative who works in your district or in another school district in the state of New Jersey, that you let your board attorney know of those folks and what your relationship is to them in terms of relative or immediate family member, because then they can keep a list and they can help to advise you as to what things may come up as a board member that you might have to vote on that you would need to recuse yourself of. And a lot of times board members will say, well, that's usually pretty apparent, but sometimes it's not. For instance, when I was on my board back in the late 90s, my daughter had mono, and so she needed to be homeschooled for, I think, a month. And the students are identified in your board agenda as a number. And I had no idea. I mean, most people don't know what their child's school ID number is. So when I went into the meeting that night, the board attorney pulled me aside and said, I just want you to know on this particular item, this particular action item, you need to recuse yourself because that's about your daughter. So I wasn't able to participate in any discussion about homeschooling her or any decision about homeschooling her. So it may not always be obvious, is my point. So the district has an opening for a guidance counselor. It would be the perfect job for your nephew who lives 2 towns away. Can the district hire your nephew?
No heads.
No, good. Remember, I can't see anybody.
No heads.
Okay. And the board is meeting to discuss the superintendent's performance evaluation. Your spouse is an aide in the district. Can you participate in that decision? No. Okay, good. So, in terms of hiring and personnel, you may not hire a relative of a board member or the chief school administrator. There may be some exceptions to this, but generally the answer is no. So so you can become a board member with a relative who already works in the district. But once you become a board member, no other relatives or immediate family members can be hired by the district, unless you were to go to, these would be hard, very hard hires, positions that are really difficult to fill. And then if the only person that was really qualified for the position was a relative of yours, the superintendent could go to the executive county superintendent, and every county in New Jersey has an executive county superintendent. They are the commissioner's representatives to the county, and could pitch why this person is the only qualified person. Usually what they'll say is, because this did happen in one of my districts back in the early 2010s, one of my districts was looking for a school nurse. It was a very small district. The only person who was qualified who applied was the wife of a board member. So they went to the executive county superintendent. The ECS said, I'd like for you to go out and advertise again and then come back and let me know. And the same thing happened. There was nobody that was qualified that had the proper certifications to be the school nurse. And so the ECS waived that provision. So they were able to hire the wife of the board member. That board member was coming off of the board at any rate because they were at the end of their term and they had already decided that they weren't going to run again. So it kind of all worked together. But you can run for the board if you have family who works in the district. It's just that once you become a board member in the district, the superintendent can't hire anybody else that's in your family. So an administrator may not exercise direct or indirect authority over the relative of themselves, of that administrator. A board member cannot take part in employment matters concerning the superintendent or supervisors in the chain of command between the relative and the superintendent. And a board member who has a conflict of interest cannot take part in the search, selection, or vote to hire the new superintendent and any post-hire evaluations or contract discussions. So there would be no taking part in the discussion about these folks and no taking part in the vote for those folks. This is a quick sheet, and I'm going to actually send you the PowerPoint for this in a PDF when we're done this evening. And I'll also send you the grid for the conflicts of interest that's a little bit more expansive than this, that I think helps to really show folks where they might stand. But this shows if you have a spouse or dependent child, a child who's not dependent upon you, or a relative who works in the district, you wouldn't be able to participate in negotiations or vote to ratify the contract. If you yourself work, or your spouse or a dependent child works in an outside of your district, but in another school district, you wouldn't be able to participate in negotiations, but you may be able to vote to ratify the contract depending on whether any other conflicts exist. And I'll talk about that in a second. If you have a child who's not dependent or a relative who works in another district outside of your district, you probably could participate in negotiations and probably participate in voting to ratify the contract. But that's absent any other conflict. It's after the memorandum of agreement, the salary guides, and the total compensation package has been attained. And also, if your family member or relative does not have heightened responsibilities within their own union outside of the school, outside of your district. Okay, so the board is voting to approve the memorandum of agreement, or the MOA, with the local education association. You're a teacher in another district. Can you participate in the vote?
Yes.
It depends. So it'll depend on whether that person whether you have a heightened involvement in your union in the other district that you're working in. And the best thing always to do is to check with your board attorney, or you can call one of our attorneys at school boards. We have an attorney of the day Monday through Friday, and you can always get to them. They can provide you with legal information, but not legal advice. The only person that can provide you with legal advice is your board attorney. Okay? So other bargaining conflicts that may exist is if you have a family member who's supervised by employees that are in the union, they're not in the unit, but the terms of employment are linked to the unit, or the immediate family member or relative has heightened union involvement. So the heightened union involvement oftentimes has to do with whether that person is involved in negotiations within the district that they work in, outside of your district. But it's always something that you want to review with your board attorney. And then A1018 was an advisory opinion that back in, I think it was around 2010, there were candidates that were running for the board that were being endorsed by their particular teachers association, their teachers union. And so the SEC said that if the teachers association was endorsing those candidates and they won their term, they won their seat on the Board of Education, they wouldn't be allowed to participate in negotiations for the first year. So if there were negotiations going on, if you were elected in the November election, you had negotiations going on starting in January, and the union endorsed you, you wouldn't be able to participate in that. Now they're doing it on a case-by-case basis because in some circumstances, the Teachers Association, in my particular district several years ago, there was a candidate who was running, and the union did not want that person to be able to participate in negotiations. So they endorsed them. The candidate had not asked for their endorsement and did not benefit financially from their endorsement at all. So now the SEC is really looking at that, and unless there's a financial contribution, they're probably going to allow the person to participate in negotiations. But again, there are some hoops that have to be gone through, and you would have to ask for an advisory opinion on that. The doctrine of necessity is something that's only to be invoked when the board is required to vote on a matter that requires the majority vote of the full membership of the board, and there are not enough members that are not conflicted to be able to vote in that. And generally what would happen is on a board of 9, if you had 5 people who were conflicted, you would ask your board attorney to invoke the doctrine of necessity, and they would draw up that paperwork for that resolution. That would need to be passed at an open public meeting, and each person on the board who had a conflict of interest, who had family member or relative, immediate family member or relative working in the district, would have to disclose that publicly. And then everybody would, upon approval of the doctrine of necessity, everybody would be able to participate. But they really don't, with the doctrine of necessity started to be used very frequently, and the SEC really didn't want that to happen. So it's really only to be invoked when it's absolutely necessary. They also went on to say that the formation of a committee, even if it's only one member, would be eligible to act as a committee because, it doesn't warrant the doctrine of necessity, because committee members don't make they make recommendations to the board, but they don't vote and make a decision on something. It's very unusual for a board to give a committee the authority to make something so. So typically the committee would bring an action item to the board, and then the board would have to vote on it. 2 non-conflicted members can obtain the assistance of the superintendent, the BA, or a consultant to help with negotiations. That doesn't require the doctrine of necessity either. Okay, so moving into volunteerism. People who run for the board have usually volunteered in their districts. They've usually been class parents, PTO, PTA parents, HSPTA parents, things like that. And so most of you, and actually what you're doing right now as a board member is a volunteer position. So what the SEC wanted you to know was that you're not banned from volunteering in the schools, but there are some things that you really do need to consider. So for instance, you can volunteer for activities that support your kids, including holding an executive position with the PTA, PTO, or HSA. However, you should refrain from certain activities based on the degree of involvement with the students or the staff. So they're asking that any kind of volunteering that you were doing be infrequent, not on a regular basis, where you could be perceived to be really enmeshed in the schools. They want to make sure that you're not perceived as being directing students or staff if you're in the buildings. So if you're going to volunteer in the school, you should let the superintendent know that you're there for a planned in-school volunteer activity in advance so that they know that. And you should never have anything to do with finances or funds. So if you're holding an executive position within the PTA or PTO, or even an education foundation within the district, we strongly recommend that you not have anything to do with money collection, distribution, taking to the bank, any of that, counting. All of those things we recommend that you not be a part of. So this is a quick questionnaire before you volunteer in the school. If you ask yourself those questions and your answers are what the answer is that's in green, and again, I'm going to send this to you, so I don't know if you can really see this or not, but I am going to send this to you. If the answers that you have are reflective of the ones that are in green on this particular slide, then your planned volunteerism is probably within the boundaries of volunteering that the SEC advises. If your answers are different than the answers that are in green, that you may be at odds with the recommendations from the School Ethics Commission. So again, this is something that if you have a question, talk to the superintendent, talk to your board counsel. You can call us. I'm not an attorney and I've never played one on TV, but I can get you to attorneys at the association who can hopefully give you information that will help you answer those questions. The next piece is about interview committees, and the SEC spoke to this a while ago, and they said that 1 or 2 board members could participate as observers in interview committees, as long as there was an administrative staff member that coordinated everything and coordinated even their participation. But that only the recommendation would only come from the superintendent, not from the board members. And they really further stated then that they encouraged board members not to be on interview committees that were not for the next superintendent. There were narrow circumstances that were subject to approval of the superintendent and the guidelines about being on interview committees for the district. And again, it's something that we don't recommend and the SEC doesn't recommend. And then in terms of exit interviews, that is not something the board should participate in. However, if you feel that as a board, you feel that you have people that are leaving you have a pretty not so good staff turnover and that the staff is turning over frequently, you may want to direct the superintendent as a board to ask the superintendent to please offer anybody who's leaving for whatever reason exit interviews. Board members would not participate in those, and you need to keep in mind that the superintendent can offer those to people who are leaving, but they can't mandate that they take part in those. So a lot of times, a lot of people will probably participate, and you may get some valuable information that may lead you to know some things that you may want to look at in your next round of negotiations, but board members are not going to be on those exit interviews either. And then you can also ask the superintendent, if you've asked the superintendent to offer exit interviews, you can ask for a report once or twice a year on what the findings are. And those can be shared with the board, obviously. So some things we want you to consider is that you develop that list of board members and administrators who have conflicts and review it regularly, usually at the time of reorganization. If you get new board members on, you want to take a look at that. Also keep in mind that sometimes board member gets on the board, has a family member who works in the district, and maybe in June that person retires or leaves to go to another position in another district. They're not conflicted anymore. So we really recommend that you review that on a regular basis. Really consult with your board attorney on ethics issues and to identify any conflicted board members or administrators. And then continue to check school board notes, which comes out once a week during the school year, for newly released advisory opinions. And in closing, really, school officials really must be cognizant of their responsibility to protect the public trust and to honor the confidence in their obligation to serve in the interest of the public and the board, and to really reevaluate the existence of potential conflicts on a regular basis. These are the links that were used for the advisory opinions and the commissioner's decisions throughout. I will be sending you this PowerPoint in a PDF as soon as we're off. I'll usually send it to the board president, the vice president, the BA, and the superintendent, and they can disperse it to everybody else. I also always add to that the acknowledgement that you've had this conversation tonight. Each board member should be signing it. You print your name on it, you sign it, and put today's date. It is March 16th. And then provide that to Dr. Maida so he can keep it with his QSAC records. And thank you for all you do for your students and for your community. I know that this has been an unprecedented year, unlike any other, and hopefully there's some light at the end of the tunnel for all of us, and that we'll be able to get back to some kind of semblance of normalcy by the fall. And what questions might you have?
Any questions? I think we're good.
Okay, please stay safe and stay healthy, and I will see you next month to talk to you about this evaluation process.
Thank you, Marianne.
All right, have a good night, everybody. Stay well.
Trustee Finley, please stay on.
Great.
Yes.
Next up, Mr. Castle's going to deal with our tentative budget resolution,
We're gonna do the audit first, get the audit.
the capital audit report.
Okay.
Hold on one second. Hold on one second. Bad volume here.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, so, this, for our audit presentation, we're gonna have Mike Andriola and Dana Montanelli from PKF O'Connor Davies do our audit presentation.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Mike Andriola, and I'm filling in for Bob Morrison as he's experienced some health issues. I was the partner on this year's audit, and I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to present the results of this year's audit. With me is my colleague, Dana Montanelli. I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself and to begin our presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Montanelli. So I was the manager on the audit, working out in the field with Dan and the rest of the office team. I'm just going to run through the audit results. I'll keep it high level, but feel free at any point if you have a question and you want to stop me, go ahead. So I will reference page numbers in the audit in case you do have it in front of you and you want to follow along, but you don't need to. I'm just going to high level go over it. So overall, this year for the audit, everything moved very smoothly thanks to Dan and the office team. It was definitely a bit challenging with all of the COVID restrictions, but they were very accommodating and really helped us turn things around. So everything went well. Overall, during the audit process, it not only impacts the business office, but we go through all aspects of the school district. So we're touching on the cafeteria, student activities, all the way over to ASSA. So everyone worked with us and everything went very smoothly. So overall, our audit opinion, you can see on page 9 of the report, or it's 17 if you're looking at the PDF. We had an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, which is a clean audit opinion, and that's the best opinion that we can give. That means that the financial statements are free of material misstatements. Our next opinion is our governmental auditing standards opinion, and that just covers internal controls around financial reporting. That's on page 141 of the report or page 167 of the PDF. And that opinion, we did have one significant deficiency this year that we had to point out, and it was related to the Community Education Fund. We had some difficulties in getting the support for some of the revenue. So we talked about that extensively with Dan, and it just seems that there was some documentation that wasn't really routine as far as the classes go and all the registrations and things like that. So we did have to comment on that in the report. And then the third opinion that we give an opinion on is the single audit, where we test the federal and the state programs, the major programs. So that one was a clean audit opinion. We had no issues with the single audit. On the federal side, we audited this year the Special Education Medical Initiative Program, Title I, and CARES money. We had no issues there. And then on the state side, we do a single audit on the state aid cluster, which is your equalization, special education, and security aid. So single audit was a clean opinion. From there, I'm just going to high level go over the financial results. I'm going to talk about the fund balances in the general fund.
I think that's on our end, Dana. Hold on one second.
Okay.
All right, I think we got it.
There you go, okay. I'm just going to talk about your general fund balances, where they ended up at June 30th, 2020. They're on the C1, which is on page 86 of the report, or page 103 if you're looking at the PDF. So overall, the general fund has a fund balance of $13,258,000, and of that, $250,000 is in the maintenance reserve. $0.5 million is in the capital reserve. And then $2,574,000 is designated for next year's 2021 budget, or the year that you're in. $2,540,000 is excess surplus for your 21-22 budget. Approximately $3.7 million was reserved for encumbrances, and then the unassigned fund balance in the general fund was $2,634,000 at June 30th, 2020. And then just to cover the enterprise funds this year, food service had a net loss of approximately $635,000, but that was due to COVID-19, and that's nothing unusual for this last year that we had. The community education fund was the first year that it was run separately. It's reported separately from the general fund, and that fund had a net income of $177,000. And then the internal service fund was closed out in this year's audit because all the self-insurance is now done except for prescription. So the fund balance in that account was transferred over to the general fund and will be reported in the general fund going forward. So those were just the high-level financial points. I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about the AMR, but if you want me to elaborate on anything, let me know.
All right, thanks, Dana. So we had a couple comments to report on in the AMR. The first one is just that we recommend the district analyze all open purchase orders at year end. The first, ensure they're properly classified between accounts payable and encumbrances, and then also to cancel any open purchase orders which won't be fully liquidated. Encumbrances, just as a reminder, they represent commitments for which an invoice was not received. Typically at year end, they relate to maintenance projects, construction projects, or maybe like professional fees where you incurred a cost but weren't necessarily invoiced before the end of the year. So that's really what encumbrances should be limited to at year end. Our second comment had to do with capital assets. We recommend that the district hire an appraisal company to do a full capital asset appraisal. So that way the district has a nice detailed list of all its capital assets that'll allow us to really have the necessary support to tie into the audited financial statements. The district's already in the process of going through this and getting an appraisal company to conduct the appraisal, so this one's already in progress. And then our final comment, which Dana touched on previously, is just regarding maintaining some of the proper support for the community education fund. Each cash receipt or payment received should really be supported so that we can tell what the payment was for and then we can ensure the proper amount was charged. This will just really help the district ensure that you have completeness and you have full accuracy of all your cash receipts. With that being said, the audit is a very thorough and detailed process, and you really do have a strong team in place in your finance office. Dan has done a lot in a short amount of time. He and his team responded very timely to our requests. They prepared all the necessary reconciliations. They were really a true pleasure to work with. I'd like to thank them for all their assistance and all their patience they had with us during this audit. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you may have.
I have a question. My name is Ava Finley. I don't know if you can see me.
Yes, I can see you, Ava.
Okay.
Yes.
You can see me. Oh, boy. All right. I have a question regarding the community ed funds. Approximately how much money are we talking about?
I can pull that up. Hold on 1 second.
So when we do our test, we only sample a small amount of transactions. So when we give a comment and when we give our perspective on the underlying support, it doesn't mean that the dollars aren't accurate. It just means that we weren't able to say this receipt related to this activity and this activity was $50 per child. Like, we weren't able to go back to that level of detail to really recalculate the receipts. So, Danny, do you have a total dollar amount that went through the fund during the year?
Yes.
Like revenues?
Yeah, so for the total revenues running through the community ed fund, for the year ended June 30th, 2020, there were approximately $989,000 running through that fund. And then from there, we take a sample and we sample some of those transactions.
So you can't give specific details as to, I mean, I read on the corrective action plan that there were six, I was just wondering, are we talking about, you know, a $500 bill here? Or are we talking about substantially more? Because we have had issues with community ed funding in the past, and I thought that we had a corrective action plan in place, and we did. And I thought that we were on the road to correcting the errors that we had in the past, and apparently we haven't. We still have 6 incidences of undocumented, I don't know, money revenue that wasn't reported or, you know, substantiated. And I was just wondering, I think we had corrected that in the past. That's all. I was just wondering how much money we're talking about.
Yeah, in the community ed program, it's traditionally a higher volume of lower dollar transactions. So to your point, they're not overly significant dollar amounts, but due to the large volume that goes through that fund, that's, you know, where we came up with a portion of those did not have that underlying support to justify the amount charged and what the activity was for.
Well, the other thing that is concerning in this time of COVID, I'm sure our community education wasn't as fully in swing as it would have been. So perhaps the undocumentation of those funds could have been higher had we not had COVID. That's all supposition. I got that. But I'm a little bit concerned because I've been on the board for a number of years. A problem in the past, and we did correct it, and now it seems to be coming back again. And I would just like the rest of the board, as well as Mr. Castles, to know. But Mr. Castles wasn't here at that particular time when we had a big problem with the community ed fund. So I'm aware that we as an old board, we had corrected this, and something has changed, and even more concerning in days of COVID, where community ed isn't as, you know, active as it might have been. I'm just concerned. Okay, thank you.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay. Mike and Dana, thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks again. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Ava, stay on. Okay. I'll do it, yeah. I'll do it real quick. Okay. So one thing on the item, on the agenda tonight that I wanted to go over really quick is the tentative budget. This is not the budget hearing that happens in April. That's where the board gets to decide to approve, deny, or amend the budget. This is the tentative budget, which allows the district to submit the budget to the county office for DOE approval and to check to make sure that it's legal in all senses of DOE regulations. Some highlights for this tentative budget, which we'll talk about in much more detail on April 27th at the budget hearing, are this is a $154 million budget. As far as revenues go, 46% of our revenues are from local taxes and tuition and local sources. 52% of the budget is from state aid. And then there is a small piece from federal sources, not even 1%, and then 2% from budgeted fund balance, which was just spoke about at the audit. That's from money left over from previous years. As far as the expense side goes, 78% of the budget is allocated to salary and benefits. The remainder goes to purchase professional, maintenance of property, supplies, and purchase services. Again, much more detail will be given at the budget presentation on April 27th.
Mr. Castles?
Sure.
Can I make a request that, I know there has to be a certain percentage of fair share that has to come from the local tax levy. Can you be prepared on April 27th to talk about that percentage? and how much it should be coming from the local tax levy, and then what are the, I guess, ramifications if we don't meet that fair share fund balance. If you could just bring that information with you, you'd be prepared to
Absolutely,
look at it?
absolutely. Yes, so the district is under local fair share, but I will discuss that and what the ramifications could be for that moving forward at the budget hearing.
Thank you.
And how that
would be-
pertains.
That would be good.
No problem. So at this point, I'll just hit on some of the highlights of the tentative budget. We are looking at an expansion of special education, both staffing and programming, expansion of guidance and social emotional learning, both staffing and programming, English language arts textbook adoption to update some of those textbooks, renewal of a Chromebook lease and infrastructure, and then funding. There's a significant amount of funding for capital projects and maintenance projects district-wide. Again, more detail will come out at the budget hearing where decisions can be made, but this is really just the approval to allow the district to submit the budget to the county office. Any questions?
No, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last item for an open workshop is the last 3 months at curriculum and at our open workshop. Dr. Degnan and Curriculum Committee have been going over G&T. He sent home the full presentation that was made to the committee. Hopefully everybody had the chance over the weekend to review that.
Yes.
No questions were presented to Dr. Degnan, so we'll just proceed. But just understand that the laws have changed and the district will have to follow the law. And I think that pretty much sums up Pam, Avon on Curriculum Committee would agree that we have to follow the law.
Right, so the proposal would be, or the recommendation would be that we would follow the law, the Strengthening Gifted and Talented Act that was put in place in January 20, and that we would be providing services now in a school-wide enrichment program, K to 8. So the current class, the 5th graders at Oresco would be the final class in 2025. And I shared all the background and information with you in the PowerPoint. Okay?
And that's included in the proposed budget, making those changes.
Is it proposed?
The changes you need to make are included in the proposed budget.
Yeah. Yes. Any questions? Okay.
Okay, just
So we'll
one
send a
last-
letter out to the 4th grade parents letting them know the change.
And then Mr. Kopaz, obviously we have our 8 HIB resolution.
Thank you, Dr. Maida. In accordance with the Bayonne Board of Education Policy 5512, during this reporting period, 1 incident of harassment, intimidation, and bullying has been reported and investigated at Bayonne High School. In this case, there was no confirmed evidence of the investigated acts of HIB. Strategies, resources, and remedial measures were implemented. All documentation is being retained by the school anti-bullying coordinator. Thank you, Dr. Maida.
And then as you saw from our committee meetings Thursday, we sent home, there were 2 field trips, and then there was a contract for special services for one of our students. And those were the only additions that are in your packets right now. Just for a quick housekeeping, the way it's going to work when we hit the auditorium, there is a special meeting of the board. We'll do that first. I will adjourn that meeting, and then we will start a new meeting with the actual monthly meeting for March. Okay?
This is adjourned?
So at this time, we're going to take an adjournment. It is 6:15. I'd like everyone in the auditorium at 6:25.
Trustee, you have another.